Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Green, and I am director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate and a professor in the Price School of Public Policy, Marshall School of Business, and Department of Economics at USC. And it is my pleasure to restart the Bedrosian Book Club, which was a wonderful institution we had at USC, invented by one of our guests uh, for many years, which involved USC and USC adjacent people discussing recent books. And I was fortunate to participate in the book club, I think a couple of times a year while it was ongoing. And the thing I loved most about it is it actually required me to read a book every now and then. So I was very grateful for that. And an opportunity has come along to restart it. And I'm thrilled to have been given the opportunity to host the first restart. So that's who we are and where we are. We're going to discuss the book by Andrew Ross Sorkin, 1929. But before we get into that, I would like our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. So first of all, the person I was referring to before, who was the brains behind the Bedrosian Book Club, Aubrey Hicks, who was with us at USC with the Bedrosian Center for many years. Aubrey, tell us more about yourself, please.
I'm Aubrey Hicks. I am a staff member at the other place in LA, UCLA. I work for the School of Education and Information Studies, and I do communications and sort of research translation for two centers at the School of Ed.
What are the centers, please?
The UCCSU Collaborative for Neuroscience,
Oh,
Diversity, and Learning.
oh,
And CRESS, which is the Center for Research on Education Standards and Student Testing.
Great, thank you. And then we have my wonderful Price School colleague, Liz Folletta. Liz, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Fletta. I am Richard's colleague. Glad to be Richard's colleague at the Price School. I am actually an architect by training, but I teach design to urban planning and real estate development students. And I am delighted that Richard is restarting this. This was one of my favorite things to do, and I'm really excited that it's back.
Well, I'm excited to have you both with me today. So, okay, let's get going. And we always like to start this. And again, I'm following Aubrey's lead on how to organize these conversations with a brief summary of the book. What's it about? Why did Sorkin write it?
So, this is exactly what the title says, 1929, Inside the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History and How It Shattered a Nation. It takes place from 1928 to about 1932, 33, and takes us into the rooms where it happened, where all of our cast of characters, which we might call cast of villains, uh, all of the things, the decisions that they made that led to the great crash in the
I'm
19.
thinking Lin-Manuel Miranda should write a musical about
Oh, that's a great
1929.
thing.
Since you talked about the room where it happens, it just hit me. Um, yeah, Liz,
Can I add something?
of
Um,
course.
the second half of the book really talks about what the policy and political responses were, which I personally found to be more interesting.
So, so yeah, I mean, is the book is kind of chatty in the first
Mhm.
half. Would you agree with that?
Uh,
Chatty, yes.
yeah.
Yeah, and so let's just start with the style of the book. And I am a very dry person, which is to say, if you want to go to sleep, I'm the person you want to talk to. And so like chattiness is not my thing. But how did you react to that? It felt like it was kind of gossipy, kind of very personality driven.
Yes. It did sort of feel, yeah, I think gossipy is a really good word for it. And there was a moment when he was talking about like this was the first celebrity age. kind of, and it did feel kind of like he got to be with these famous and rich people, and he was
Mhm.
excited about it. That was the
I
tone. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think it had the feel of um what newspapers might have been like at the time too. Like I feel like there was a sort of late 20s style to
Mm.
that gossipiness.
Oh, you're saying the book sort of replicated the way newspapers would have been in the 20s?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. That hadn't occurred to me.
Yeah, me
I
either.
mean,
So,
modernized, but I do think there was a sense of like, these were the things that people were interested in and how it might have been talked about in in on Wall Street, not necessarily in the heartland or
yeah. But that's I really hadn't thought about that. So stylistically, and again, more modern style, but nevertheless, uh, the sort of way they would have reported. And to some extent, there's a parallel to today, right? Is if we look at the business press, and by the way, Mr. Sorkin is very much part of the business press. He writes on business for the New York Times. He puts out a piece every day that I get in my email every day, which I will say I find very useful, called Deal Book.
Mm.
Uh, I'm not always crazy about the way he reports things, but the topics he picks are usually, he's very good. He has very good taste in relevant topics, is the way I will put it. Um, but
and this is a relevant topic.
yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, you think about these guys, right? And I'm going to bring one out in particular is Charles Edwin Mitchell, who is the chairman and
Mm.
CEO of National City Company and National City Bank, which sort of is a precursor. I mean, it's complicated to today's Citibank. So one of the largest banks, one of the four largest banks, the four largest banks in America. And by the way, one that constantly is getting into trouble and somehow wiggling out of it, not
Mm.
necessarily because of financial acumen,
Mm.
uh, is, early in the book, there's a description of worries about bank runs.
Hmm.
And he does something to try to head that off. Do you remember what it was?
Bought back his own stock.
Yeah, he bought back his own stock, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a remarkable lack of transparency
Hmm.
in the dealings of this very important, what became, because of Mitchell's leadership, and I have to say that when he took over the bank, it was not a particularly important bank. By the time he almost got it to the point where it was the largest bank in the country, didn't quite make it. But there were a lot of shenanigans involved in trying to make things look more valuable than they actually were.
Hmm.
I mean, is that fair? Do you think that's a takeaway?
That's more than fair. I
Okay.
mean,
Yeah.
I think my issue, one of my issues was that there was not a lot of value judgment from our author. And on one hand, I can see that, but on the other hand, these were underhanded tricks and um, caused the greatest crash in Wall Street history
Mhm.
and affected every single person in the world. Most.
Mhm.
Yeah. So do 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 either one of you have a personal story about how much someone you know was affected by this?
My grandparents didn't talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So mine didn't either. However, when my grandmother died and my wife and I were cleaning out her apartment, we found within books cash all over the place.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I do remember her telling me about having their deposits in something called the Bank of the United States, which is briefly
Yeah.
featured in this book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
as one of the bank failures. And you would think, of course, Bank of the United States sounds as sound as a dollar, right? And so that you could trust that your money was there, would be there. And one morning they wake up and it's not. It's just gone. And so I could tell you, I didn't know about the cash until, um, you know, until she passed. But it to me reflected, but she did talk about her mistrust of banks.
Mm.
And to me, that it wasn't just she was saying something, that she felt the need to stash money, well, not
Hmm.
under the mattress, but within the leaves of books,
Hmm.
uh, tells me a lot about how scarring this
Mm.
was to her,
Mm.
even if she didn't talk about it.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I
So,
can just remember my grandparents using everything into just like they never bought anything new. They used everything, they saved everything. We might need this 20 years from now. Let's put it in our basement. Uh,
Mhm.
and and they lived in the same house for 70 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had neighbors when I lived in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and um, they were siblings that all lived together, and they kept yogurt containers. They kept
Yeah.
everything they could possibly use until they couldn't even walk in their house, because
Yeah.
they didn't want to get rid of anything.
Yeah.
so I'm going to shamelessly self-promote a paper that I wrote with a guy named Pat Hendershot. Gosh, it was 18, 19 years ago. And one of the takeaways is that who were born during the Great Depression consume differently
Yeah.
anyone else for the rest of their lives. And so I
Huh.
think it's important for the audience to have a sense, and I don't think this book does a good job of giving that sense of how much this damaged people.
Yeah.
Well, and he explicitly said at the beginning that he wasn't going to look at that,
Yeah.
which I was like, what? That made absolutely no sense
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah.
Uh,
We looked at all of the big people, the big
yeah,
decision
people.
makers.
Yeah,
Um, and there were a few characters briefly mentioned, shoeshine people in Wall
Yes, who bought
Street.
stock because of
boys.
tips. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right. And,
farm,
people,
farm.
at National City who bought shares,
Yeah, bank tellers.
bank tellers, and then, wound up having to keep paying because they bought
Yeah.
them on margin, right?
Well, and the people I wanted to know more about, because what was new to me was this like I can borrow money to buy stock thing.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
insane. And but it sounded to me like regular people were doing that, like not just famous people, but they were encouraging the regular citizen to be doing this. And that's what I wanted to know more about.
Uh, yeah, that
Yeah.
was a Raskog, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Democratic Party guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, one of the things we try to teach our real estate students, that I don't think they internalize as well as they might, is how debt is a two-edged sword.
Yeah.
So debt can absolutely enhance your returns. So if you're borrowing, and I'm trying to remember, but let's say they were borrowing, I think at 5 or 6%, and the
Hmm.
stock market was making 10%, then that money on your, I mean, that's free money,
Mm.
basically. But the problem is, if the stock market corrects, to use the euphemism, which means falls,
Yeah.
and you owe more than your stocks are worth, then you got to go find the money somewhere. And the thing about if you buy a stock just with your own money, not borrowing it, the worst that
Hmm.
can happen to you, you get wiped out, but you
Is
don't
your
have
money.
to go get more money at that
Right.
point. Your losses are limited to,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, and with shorting stock, your losses are infinite, right?
could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Because you think about it. So one of the, I mean, I'm going to make a reference to something. Have you guys seen the movie Trading Places?
A long
Ed-
time ago.
Eddie
Yeah.
Murphy,
Yeah.
Eddie Murphy movie, Dan Aykroyd. They do a brilliant job of explaining short selling.
Oh, I'll
in
have to
that.
watch it.
Yeah, yeah, toward the end of that movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, the deal is, and for our audience, a short sale is where you sell stock that you don't own. You basically borrow someone else's stock so that it's available to sell to somebody at some point in the future. And if you think the value of the stock is going to fall, you say, I'll sell I will sell this to you as someone who doesn't own stock for $50.
Hmm.
And if the stock goes down to 40, you basically purchase those shares you borrowed at 40, sell at 50 and make a profit of $10 a share on the deal. Um, and if stocks actually fall, and your shorts are correct, you will make a lot of money doing that because you didn't have to buy stock, you just have borrowed it, which means you do have to pay like an interest payment on it, but you don't have to pay somebody for those shares, right? Um, so that's the good news. The bad news is, so let's say you make the short sale for $50 and you agree to fulfill the contract at the end of March, say we're toward the end of March, and the stock goes up to $80. Okay, you got to buy that stock now for $80 in order to sell it for 50, which means you've lost $30. Okay, that's where the possibility of infinite loss arises because, in principle, the stock could rise to any amount you could imagine, and you have to pay that difference. And
Hmm.
that's why a lot of people have gone bankrupt trying to short the stock market.
Yeah, it seems crazy. I had to look up short selling because I didn't understand it. And I was like, well, who would give their stock to be, who would let their stock be borrowed for this purpose? And I
Mhm.
guess if you open a margin account, you automatically agree that your stock could be borrowed. That
Well,
that's,
and you get paid, usually you get paid handsomely.
but what I read is like the brokerage gets paid, but the person who owns the original stock doesn't get paid.
No, they get paid in it. Okay, that's if you wrote that, that's not.
But
They
I
get
read
paid. They get
investment.
paid. They basically get paid interest.
Yeah.
So it
Okay.
is like they're, and the broker takes a cut. There's no question about
Yeah.
that. But it is when they say they're lending you the stock, they are really
Some
lending it to you,
compensation.
and you've got to
Yeah.
pay some interest on that loan that
Yeah.
you've taken out, just like you would with money. So
Okay.
anyway,
Use that up.
how about parallels with today? So how does this book relate to where we are at the moment?
I'm gonna let Aubrey start with that one.
I was going to say, in so many ways, I keep describing it as parallel so close that it might as well be a line.
Uh-huh.
Um, the sort of larger than life celebrity financiers who are also villains,
Mm-hmm.
um, and wind up making more money
Mm-hmm.
no matter what. Um, these, huge corporations, monopolies, um, uh, tariffs.
Right, tariffs.
Tariffs. I mean, it feels like, yeah, we're set up for years of inflation. I think the parallels. Um, I think that's why I said out earlier when we were talking that I was glad that I had read the book because it was a refresher on all of those things. I think um, I learned about this, but it's not something that I am not an economist. It's not something I think about all the time. And so it was good, but it was also really frustrating to realize that, yeah, we're doing it all over again.
Yeah. No, I mean, two things really stood out to me. And one was just that the numbers seemed big even for today.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Like 12 million, like or 76 million or whatever, like the type of returns these people were just the sheer amount of money that people were receiving from a stock pool or putting the amount that Mitchell paid to buy his own bank stock. Those numbers are large now, and imagine what they were 100 years ago.
Well, yeah, the relative to so let's just I don't remember offhand what total GDP was in 1929, but I do know that we didn't cross a trillion until something like 1967. We're now at about 30 trillion. So
Yeah.
the economy was, I seem to remember it was like 200 billion during World War II. So it was less than 1% the size of the economy right now in nominal dollars.
Yeah. Yeah. So the nominal dollars seem big to me even now. And I guess that put the billionaire class in context for
Yeah.
me a little bit, I guess. And then the other thing that really stood out to me, because I really, I like the second half of the book more than the first, when there was at least some kind of reckoning. Um, but it was really, I think we're really at a similar moment in that the values and the tone has shifted radically, very quickly, and in so many ways, in so many arenas, not even just this arena. And that seemed to happen to Mitchell, and he seemed very confused about what was happening to him. And but it's happening in it's happening in the classroom, it's happening in our politics, it's happening everywhere, that there's this shift has happened, and we don't know the rules right now.
Mm, yeah.
And it makes it so much, it's exciting in the way that I think change is more possible perhaps now because things are more extreme, but it's terrifying and confusing.
Mm,
So I think that is what really kind of resonated with me, that there was this, everybody was really excited about money and being wealthy in the 20s, and then suddenly we're not. And and then there's this line at the last part of the book that I really appreciated, that is it's talking about the minister making a sermon, referring to the crash. But anyway, it says the title of his sermon was "Moral People Who Burlesque Morality are the worst enemies of our modern morals." So people who make making money like this, you know, a positive contribution to the community, which in some I can understand that in some ways, but taken to this extreme, yeah.
Well, the thing is, there's a difference between, and he does talk a little bit about this. So there's a difference between somebody who makes money in a manufacturing company, for example, because
Right.
they're putting out
Exactly.
a product that people really
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
Right? If they weren't, say what I mean, Henry Ford, there's all kinds of bad things I could say about him. The automobile, there's bad things we could say about that too. But let's face it, people love the Model T. It
Yeah.
was a transformative, not just invention, but product that
Mhm.
normal people, ordinary people could afford to get around independently, which at
Mhm.
the time was incredible, right?
Amazing. Yeah.
Amazing. And
Yeah.
that's very different from people who, as some people say, just move money around.
Yeah. Well, and that was the other interesting thing, just from a historical perspective, is because things like that were transforming our economy and transforming agriculture. We had all these people in rural places with losing their jobs and losing their livelihood. Um, I don't know. It seemed kind of rich to me that the industrialists were critiquing the financial guys.
So, um, well, as I said, I think, I mean, ultimately, this led to urbanization, and one could argue that there's a lot of positive things that result for people with
Yes.
urbanization. But I do want to talk about the change in tone that arose because of the crash.
Hmm.
Let's talk about Carter Glass a little bit, the senator from Virginia who was the one of the co-authors of Glass-Steagall. And here is, I will tell you the gossipy thing I did not know before this book that I enjoyed learning is that Glass, who was in the Senate, and Steagall was in the House, couldn't stand each other. So I found that kind of amusing and interesting. I don't know that it was particularly important, but I still found it amusing and interesting.
But they're married together forever now, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Never gonna
But,
think that it's not together.
so why don't you tell us a little about Carter Glass, who he was and what he did?
Me or
Either one
Aubrey?
of you.
It should be Aubrey.
It should be you. I keep going first.
Okay. So he was in the Senate, right?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and he I think he was one of the people who originated the act that established the Federal Reserve
Yes.
in 1913,
Yes.
um, following the Panic of 1907, which I also didn't know much about before reading this book. Um, and he, I guess, was on the banking committee and had really made this his life's work, it seems. And he, I think was at the end of his career and was actually quite ill, and was really trying to get this through. But he was really excited. He was really committed to the separation of commercial banking from investment banking. And Stiegel, I guess, was more interested in the security, insuring deposits.
That's right.
And I thought it was interesting that, again, just with the numbers, like initially, bank deposits were insured up to $2,500, and now it's $250,000. But
Which, come to give it, relative to the size of the overall economy, sound is about right.
is about right. Oh,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
that's good. He seemed cantankerous. The thing that really stood out to me was that his hometown of Lynchburg wanted to make a Carter Glass Day, and he said no. So,
Aubrey, anything you want to add about Senator Glass?
Um, so a couple things. So I read on LinkedIn
mm,
a quote by a philosopher who was saying that solutions fix, quote, problems, that they've fixed them within the structures of
mhm,
relations that spawned them. So solutions don't stop a problem, but they reinforce the logic that created the problem.
mm,
And um, in many ways, I think Glass wanted reform, but also, you know, really liked the structures that were already there. So reform, but not necessarily um, to actually solve anything, but to keep the structures in place. And I think because he was also described as having two passions, one of which was just being a racist.
That's right. That's what I was hoping one of you might mention. Yeah.
And how much in capitalism, uh, racism is
mhm.
central to it.
Yeah.
Um, in at least our version of capitalism, racism has been central to that, and extraction and that sort of thing. So that was one of the really, it just clicked in my mind that, that while Glass-Steagall did solve a lot of problems,
Mm.
um, but it also sort of fixed the structures in place.
So I guess this is where, as you know, both of you, I am hopelessly centrist compared to you two. And I do think capitalism is redeemable if it's done right. I don't like the idea of the federal government running businesses. I don't think it would do it very well.
Mhm.
And generally, when governments have tried to run business, they haven't done it very well. But putting safety rails on the worst excesses of capitalism is, I think, good policy. And I always, I struggle with someone like Carter Glass because, on the one hand, he clearly, even by the standards of his time, and I try to avoid
Mm.
presentism, his attitudes toward race were truly appalling. Um, Aubrey, I think you're right, is that they reflected a desire to not have too much change in the world more generally, and that's problematic. But on the other hand, and we get into FD. Oh, and by the way, I got to raise one of my big complaints in the book is we have a couple of chapters about FDR toward the end of the book.
Yeah.
And Sorkin writes something that I am pretty sure is not true.
Oh,
Is he says that FDR got elected because of his opposition to prohibition, not because of the state of the economy. And he bases this based on one paper that, if I recall, I looked it up, is 6 or 7 pages long in a political science journal that's not a heavily cited journal. And it just, when the entire narrative about the 1932 election has been for 96 years that it was about the economy, stupid, to
Mhm.
make this statement, and he just makes this bald statement that the election was not about the economy, but was rather about prohibition, with that little evidence behind it. That
Mhm.
is the sort of stuff that really irks me. Uh, and I'm sure most readers just passed over it and didn't even pay attention because it's a paragraph at most in the book. But it really matters because FDR was a radical in ways that people can't even imagine right now.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
think the very idea of I'm going to say a number of things. Deposit insurance,
Mhm.
um, real securities regulation, and you could argue that it could have gone further, but we went from the Wild West to a regulated securities market.
Mm.
Um, the invention of Fannie Mae,
Mm.
the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which had lots of pluses and minuses. I mean, if it hadn't been a racist entity, it would have had nothing but pluses, in my opinion, but there was racism embedded in it. And of course, social insurance, Social Security, I think would have been unheard of if we hadn't had this calamity happen. And I shouldn't have used that was the past tense and excuse me, passive voice, and it wasn't passive. There were a whole lot of decisions that people made. That was passive again, wasn't it? People made a whole bunch of decisions that led to this calamity. But I do think out of this crisis, we did learn for a while, and we did put guardrails in place that genuinely helped stabilize the financial system and raise living standards in a meaningful way. But then what tends to happen is things go along just fine for a while, and people say, oh, why do we need interference in these markets?
Yeah.
And so we have, the savings and loans in the
Mm.
70s. We have, which again was about adult supervision going away from people who had access to other people's money. Okay, that collapses. And then we have, of all people, George Herbert Walker Bush comes in with a law called Faria and makes things better
Yeah.
because we were much more heavily regulated uh, in the depository sector. And then, we go 20 years and then suddenly we say, oh, mortgages, any kind of mortgage is fine and they're always safe. And, and now I think, and this is my own view, not necessarily anybody else's, but I see crypto as sort of being the current manifestation of this. But we go through these cycles of, again, removing supervision, having the inevitable result, putting in reforms as a result of the absence of supervision, having things calm down, that calm leading people to complacency. Supervision goes away, we have a problem again, lather, rinse, repeat.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, but it is interesting that, I mean, Glass, as you said, he wanted the separation of investment banking and commercial banking. And it'll be interesting to see if we start talking about that. I mean, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, we had a little bit of separation, but not complete separation. if we return to that. It'll be interesting to see what happens going forward.
I was I was watching television on my iPad the other day, and there was an ad for a bank, and I think it was E-Trade, even like basically saying we're a brokerage and a commercial bank. Isn't this great? Come, put your money here. And I was like, okay, wow. Um, because I hadn't realized that. I mean, I guess that law got changed in 1999.
Hmm.
How did they change
Like
it?
that. What?
How
Oh,
did they step
it
up
was the
or they,
Clinton. It was the Clinton administration
yeah.
that did it with Graham Leach Bliley and
Okay.
Larry Summers and Bob Rubin and Bill Clinton cheered this on.
Uh-huh.
And Bob Rubin was the chair of Goldman Sachs
Mhm.
and a really smart guy. And I have many confessions, mistakes I have made in my life, and one is I really admired
Hmm.
Rubin and Summers at the time. I thought they were right. I
Hmm.
thought, oh, this infrastructure is too old in a modern interstate banking, international banking world. And, these guys seem like responsible people. And I thought Alan Greenspan was a responsible person. I proved wrong to be wrong about that. And so, and I think Bill Clinton was one of the smartest presidents we've ever had.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I myself became complacent. Uh, I'll tell you a moment that changed my whole view of the world. And it was 2000, it was roughly 2007. And I was invited to a conference at the Harvard Business School, and it was about is the mortgage market going to collapse? It hadn't quite yet.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure why I was invited, but I was invited. And there were all these professors from Harvard and Stanford and MIT and so on. And I'm pretty sure Elizabeth Warren was the person who did this. She was a Harvard law professor at the time. And she said, okay, how many of you in the room have an adjustable rate mortgage? And half the people in the room said they did.
Oh, wow.
How many of you can tell me what your interest rate is tied to? Is it 1 year Treasury? Is it LIBOR, et cetera? Okay. If you can, remain standing. Otherwise, sit down. Half people sat down. And then she said, if you could tell me the margin between that index and what you pay, remain standing. Otherwise, sit down. Another half of people sat down. And then finally, she said, if you could tell me the maximum interest rate you could pay on your mortgage, what the cap is, remain standing. And at that point, there was one person who remained standing.
Mm.
And the person sitting next to me said, I know that guy. He would never admit in public that he didn't know something. So, but you get the point. It is here a bunch of academics didn't really understand their mortgage. And that's what made me understand how important consumer protection was in these markets. And maybe we overdo it. It's possible we at times have overdone it, but it's better to overdo it. The catastrophe that if you overdo it, the downside is there, but it's small.
Yeah.
If you underdo it, you get these kind of catastrophic events.
I I remember right around that time I got a mortgage. And I'm I had my real estate development degree. Like I understand mortgages and and I went and talked to this guy and he asked me what I wanted and I told him I wanted a fixed rate 30-year mortgage. The loan docs came and it was an adjustable rate mortgage. And I read the documents, but not everyone would have read the documents.
Or
But
even if they did understand what they were about.
yeah, no, that's true. I mean, but I was shocked that this man thought I was an idiot and that, and I went and got a mortgage somewhere else. But yeah.
So I think one of the most complicated things to do is develop appropriate levels of consumer protection in financial markets.
Mm.
I'm pretty sure letting people borrow as much money as they want to buy stock is not. I think that level of consumer protection is saying no, you can't do that is a really good idea. But it is you do want people to have opportunities.
Mhm.
Um, it is interesting now is 401ks and 403bs, you're going to be permitted to invest them in non-publicly traded entities. I'm not sure that's a great idea. Uh, but again, we're in this world where the idea of supervision is seen as problematic, and I hope I'm wrong about it, but I don't see great outcomes arising from this.
Mm-mm. Mm.
Yeah,
So,
agreed.
um,
Yeah,
yeah,
I just can so all of this, and can we go back to prohibition?
yeah,
Um,
of
because
course.
sorry. I mean, I think I don't, I don't think you can make a statement like he made offhandedly, uh, and you know, come across as knowing what you're talking about. On the other hand, I think there is a lot to be said for how prohibition and what happened after prohibition and the Roaring Twenties and the growth of wealth for wealth's sake and Al Capone and speakeasies and this sort of underground who knows you're cool if you know you know um, an
That's a
underground
really interesting
economy.
take.
Underground economy does sort of mirror what was happening in the banks on a national scale.
Mm.
Um, so I think, yeah, it was about the economy and the prohibition and how people felt about prohibition. Prohibition also had to do with the economy, and not just, morality or whatever we pretended it was about.
So that one accelerated the other, is what you're saying.
No, I think they're just so linked. I mean, you can't, I don't know that you can, I don't know that you can unlink the excesses
Mhm.
that prohibition
Well,
caused and the excesses that were happening in this financial space. It
it's
was,
the idea that here you have a set of rules, right, in
mm,
prohibition,
mhm,
and say what you will about those rules. They were the rules.
mhm,
Um, glad we don't have it anymore. And there was a class of people who felt as if the rules didn't apply to them. And
mhm.
so they flouted the rules. And
Made a ton of money.
once and made a ton of money. And so once people give themselves permission to not follow the rules in one area of life, they may give themselves permission not to follow the rules in another area of life. I is that Aubrey? Does that summarize or does that oversimplify?
No, I mean, I just think, um, possibly oversimplifying. I do think that yes, you're right that crossing a line gets easier the more lines you cross. Um, for instance, it was Mitchell, right? Who, or was it Raskob? Who it was Raskob who ordered his Manhattan at this special club every day after work, right? Like, and that was not an underground thing, Um, but also I think in terms of culturally, what are the things that become sexy, become
Mm.
celebrity, become and the flapper, the speakeasies, that was sexy. That's what people when they wanted to walk on the wild side would do, right? And and at the same time, the media is making these, financial gurus, shaman, whatever, into a type of celebrity. And now we have, people like Elon Musk and the Kardashians, and it's all um I think it's all tied together, um, that there was this need for excess. Um, yeah, I don't know. I also think, this rise in making money for money's sake has really um, can't be separated from the prosperity gospel that has sort of gone into
Yeah,
this white nationalist Christian thing that is MAGA right now.
but
Um,
also just like the American dream,
yeah.
right? I mean, like people came to America to not maybe not necessarily to be wealthy, but to be wealthier and have more opportunities than they had elsewhere. So I think it's baked into our founding at some level.
Well, it's also probably a little baked into our founding about this, what I'll call contempt for rules and almost celebrating people who don't like rules. My Canadian friends of mine point, Canada's much less violent than the US, right? And there's no particular reason to think that they should be any more or less, as we share common ethnicities, histories, et cetera, et cetera. But my Canadian friends say, yeah, but we never overthrew a king and you did. So you started with a violent act and we didn't.
Mm.
And I thought always, now I don't know how, if you talk to a historian whether they would find any merit at all in that, but I've always found it a little intriguing.
I mean, I think we all started with multiple violent acts.
True.
So um
The religious Puritans who came over, the first thing they did was persecute other religious people who had been persecuted. Um, and the first thing that we did in Canada, we did in America was genocide. I don't mean to be a downer. I'm just like, I
well,
think,
this book is hardly a
no, it's not. It is not an upbeat. But I do think it's worthwhile to think about the parallels and to really think about in this moment where we're facing similar issues, um, who gets to make decisions.
So let's wrap up by talking about, if you could change this book in any way, or if you were to advise Andrew Ross Sorkin. I keep saying Aaron because I think of, the West Wing. Andrew Ross Sorkin. Uh, on what would make this book better. What do you think would make this book better?
Uh, I wanted a detailed visual timeline because I wanted to understand. Uh, yeah, the book was in such a narrative format that I, you know the story, but you don't know. It would have been helpful to have this visual timeline in
We
my.
also went back and forth in time a
Yeah.
lot. Yeah. So
Well,
Yeah.
and then also like, and I'm sure this is only my problem. Um, the dates for the chapters annoyed the hell out of me because
mhm.
they didn't all happen on just that one day. Like the chapter would, right, like you said, go
I
back and
hadn't thought about that, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
and
that was
I
really
was
annoying.
and then he didn't say, okay, October 28th, Black Monday. Like I didn't, so I got lost in, yeah, I got lost in many different ways. I got lost with all the characters. I got lost with all the dates. I got lost with um, yada yada, many things. And then my other complaint is, there's only one woman in the book, and she was an astrologist.
It wouldn't pass the Bechdel test.
Yeah, because I'm pretty sure, like, I mean, there were wives who got sold stock to avoid taxes
And lost money.
and lost money.
I'm
But
trying to
I,
remember,
There,
did they talk about Frances Perkins at all in the book?
mm,
Yeah, I
mm,
think she was FDR's labor secretary and I think the first woman to be a member of cabinet.
Yeah.
Maybe. I'm gonna look that up.
I don't remember.
Yeah, I'm not remembering it either. Aubrey, what would you do to change the book? Or what advice, that's different. What advice would you give to
Hmm.
improve the book?
Um, I think this goes back to something that you said before we started recording about it feels like these characters are on a heroic journey. And um, I think more criticism is both warranted and necessary. And I agree with Liz that, the time, the back and forth. I mean, there was one chapter, it starts in 1930, ends in 1932, and then the next chapter is 1931. And it was like, because we were following, FDR, and then we were,
Yeah, yeah.
it was a little bit sort of back and forth. And so if you were less familiar, you sort of had to really work to contextualize yourself.
Yeah.
So, Richard, I
Yeah.
did. Frances Perkins is in the book once,
Okay.
page 119, quoting about Al Smith as an awful crank to deal with, fussy and hard to get along with,
Okay.
talking about a man.
All right. So there you go. I do want to come back to the timeline point. I mean, one of the things, so if you don't mind, I'm going to share my annoyance or problem, is I think, and it relates to your points about timeline, he didn't connect the dots well enough.
Yeah.
And I'll give a very specific example is after the crash, after Black Monday, he says banks were fine the next day. And then suddenly 3 months later or something like that, hundreds of banks were failing. And he never talked about the mechanism by which that happened. Well, of course, when people bought on margin and the value of their stocks fell, and they needed to make good on their contracts, they went to their bank in order to get money out to fill the contracts. Well, that led to runs on banks, which led to banks becoming insolvent and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that would have taken a paragraph or two to kind of explain how we got from one point to the next. And that to me was the most egregious example. But throughout the book, he doesn't connect the dots. And I think if you're writing a book like this for a general audience, it's your responsibility to do some dot connecting. So, um, with that, our hour is up. So, I want to thank Liz Folletta and again, the person whose brainstorm this was, Aubrey Hicks, for participating in this reboot of the Bedrosian Book Club. My name is Richard Green, and I'll look forward to our next episode.